Morning. Well, I guess we can start. Get here. Got some people joining us online. Quiz today, due by 11:30. Make sure you do it. We also have the logistic growth homework. So those equations, you had practice problems that you do it. Work on it yourself. You can watch videos to get the answers, see how it's done. That was done on that frozen day that we had the major ice storm of 2020. Feel confident doing that stuff. Then you have the homework to complete. I think it's 5 problems. So go ahead and have your answers ready, and then open up the quiz part. You have 5 minutes basically to upload your answers. You've got 3 attempts to upload your answers, so that way when you're done and you hit submit, it'll tell you which ones you got wrong, and you can go back and check. It's rounded to the whole number. Round your answers to the whole number. I did not round until the very end. So I basically used the calculator, as you saw that I did up on the board here. Used parentheses, did one big equation. All right, hit equal sign, got my number, then I rounded to the whole number. All right. If you have questions, please email me. So did anyone have questions about it? Did anyone attempt to do that? Any of those? Nope. All right, well, let's start. Pick up where we left off. So we're talking about interaction of regulatory factors, right? We introduced the exponential growth curve and had those 5 assumptions. Big assumption being unlimited resources, constant R, a constant intrinsic rate of growth. And you don't normally see that because natural selection is built on competition for those limiting resources. So we know that populations they won't grow without bounds. All right, they're going to start to grow, and then you're going to have all of these different regulatory factors that help to limit our population sizes. All right, and that's what we're talking about. And we talked about top-down and bottom-up factors. We talked about our density-dependent factors, density-independent factors. And a lot of this, they're not operating in isolation. Right? They're all operating together to produce the overall dynamics that we see. And we said that it takes these long-term studies to really get a feel for what's happening in a population. Yeah, if we go out and study a population for a couple of years, we may conclude that predation controls our population. Predation regulates our population. And that's fine, that's true. But the very next year, the year that you stop studying that population, you can see that some other factor now becomes dominant. So we don't have just a single factor that's working, you have a bunch of factors. And that leads us to this next part, interaction of populations. So we have all of the dynamics. We've been talking about individual populations. But you recognize, or should be recognizing, that populations aren't closed. you have movement, you have dispersal. How does that affect our populations? And one important idea is this concept of a metapopulation. All right, so think back to some of the biology classes that you've had, and I'm saying going back to elementary school and to high school. All right, one of the major problems that we have here in the world is fragmentation. Humans, as they're trying to develop land, they're going to cut down forests, they're going to plow fields, they're going to build up residential areas, they're going to build up commercial areas. They're basically breaking this landscape that used to be continuous for organisms to live in into individual patches. And you've probably heard that this is detrimental, that organisms can't respond. And that had been the prevailing thought, or at least that was the prevailing thought in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, until some people started looking and saying, hold on, we fragmented the populations. Some of our organisms should be going extinct, yet they're thriving. Populations are still around. You're seeing them grow and changing and so forth. I think we're streaming still. Hold on, let me check here. Yeah, I think we're still going. I don't know, it looks like the live stream has just like paused, but no, it's there, just a delay. All right, so anyways, I said people thought, populations were gonna be devastated by this, and instead they saw that populations didn't. There were, a big study on songbirds. It's out in Europe, and they thought these songbirds, we devastated their habitat. They should be going extinct, but they weren't. They were thriving. And it made them ask the question, why? What's going on? Well, they saw that these songbirds are actually functioning like a metapopulation. And that was kind of how they came up with this term, a metapopulation. So what is a metapopulation? Metapopulation is basically a population of populations. All right? It's a group of populations that are connected by varying degrees of dispersal. And their interactions, their connections, is what's maintaining the entire metapopulation. It's maintaining the stability of our population. All right? Now, what we recognize is that each of these individual populations has its own regulatory factors. It has its own dynamics. And that's kind of part of our environmental variability, that contingency that we always talk about. Is that their individual habitats leads to intrinsic rate of growth, what value that is. It leads to the carrying capacity and so forth. All right? But what people didn't recognize at the time was that dispersal played a huge role in maintaining these populations. So how does a metapopulation actually function? So our landscape is going to be composed of inhospitable patches with habitable patches interspaced throughout it. All right, so you've got the spatial mosaic of habitat patches in, you can say, a sea of inhospitable habitat. It's these habitat patches where our organism can live, or our populations can live. Now, these patches are going to vary in both size and quality, and that's going to play an important role. So good quality patches are going to sustain solid populations, what we might say is a healthy population. High carrying capacities, good intrinsic rate of growths. Same thing, large sizes can hold a lot of individuals there. All right. You also have these poor habitats, maybe not as good, not as large. Maybe they can sustain a population, but they're not really good. Maybe our intrinsic rate of growth isn't as high as some of the other ones. Now, you've got these patches where our populations, where patches that would sustain a population in each of them, and then they're connected by corridors. All right? And the corridors are basically connections for dispersals. All right? Some of the corridors are pretty obvious. If we look at San Angelo, you've got the eastern and western side, or I should say the north to the eastern side and the northwestern side. Running through the city is the red arroyo. That's a great corridor for our organisms to move through the city. All right? So we would call it, that's a corridor. It allows dispersal. And that's the function of these corridors. It's to allow dispersal of individuals between these habitats. The probability of dispersal between these habitats is affected by three main things. First, the vigility of our organism, and we've talked about that before. All right? We've talked about that before. If an organism can move, they're more likely to disperse. If an organism can't move, they're not likely to disperse. All right? Simple idea. The second thing is the quality or the nature of the corridor itself. Some corridors are going to be great for movement. They're great for dispersal. The organism's going to feel some sort of protection. They're going to move freely through there. Other corridors, not so much. I think back to when I was, I think middle school or early high school. I remember, great idea. People said, hey, we're going to save animals from being hit by cars by building tunnels under the roadways, tunnels under the interstates. And at the time, I just thought that was so, it was so idiotic. Because why would an animal recognize that as a tunnel and say, hey, that's a great idea, I'm going to avoid cars? No, they're going to cross the street and then we're going to hit them. All right? But that's a corridor. If it's a good quality corridor, if the nature of the corridor is good, our organism can move through it. It's more likely to move through it. And then the last thing is distance between patches. And hopefully this kind of also is somewhat intuitive. If two patches are close together, you're more likely to have dispersal between them. Patches that are far apart, they're less likely to move between them. So this is an example of a metapopulation. All right? You've got a collection of populations in each of these habitat patches. Some of our populations are doing well, high population size. Some of them are not so well, lower population sizes. All right? What makes them high population size versus low, it depends on the quality and the size of the habitat. So what I've done is kind of change the size to represent size of the habitat. All right? And then I marked it green or brown as a quality. So if you have a good quality habitat, you're going to sustain a good population size. The corridors are these arrows. And what I've done with the arrows is increase their width to represent the quality of the corridor that they have. The better the quality, the more dispersal that's going to take place. So you have a lot of dispersal that's taking place here, combination of good quality corridor and closeness of our patches. Here, it's not as wide. Could be a good quality corridor, but note the distance between these patches. You don't have as much dispersal. And I also bring your attention to these two habitats. That's suboptimal habitat. I thought I had gotten the font sizes correct. But suboptimal habitat, low ends. Note that we don't have any migration away from these habitats. All of the arrows point towards them. All right? And that's kind of important because what it's suggesting is that these populations, these patches, might sustain a population, but they're not at a level where we're going to see a lot of migrants, a lot of dispersals from those areas. Now, each of these patches is going to have its own dynamic. It's going to have its own intrinsic rate of growth and its own carrying capacity. But what makes this a true metapopulation is that each of these patches, regardless of quality, has a distinct and real probability of going extinct. All right? Even this one, this big habitat that's optimal, we have a very real possibility that this population will crash and go locally extinct. Now, the probability of going extinct depends on the habitat itself. So if we're a habitat of good quality, we're going to have a lower extinction risk. If we have a large habitat size, a habitat that's very large in size, we're going to have a lower probability of going extinct. But in no case do we ever have a single patch where our probability of extinction is 0. every single patch has to have a probability of going extinct. If it doesn't, then this isn't a metapopulation at all. All right? So our metapopulation has each of these patches with their own dynamics, and each patch has a possibility of going extinct. When these patches do go extinct, a metapopulation relies on dispersal of individuals from these other patches to recolonize those now extinct patches. So each of these patches can go extinct, but when they go extinct, they're just going to be recolonized. They might be recolonized that next year. They might take several years for them to be recolonized, but they can get recolonized. And they're recolonized by the dispersals that then depend on the quality of our corridors and so forth. All right? So of this example metapopulation, these suboptimal habitats probably have a much higher extinction risk. They're probably going extinct regularly. So that some years we're going to go out there, we'll see our organism of interest, and then the next year they may be gone. And then they reappear. And that's kind of what drew the attention of the researchers in Europe with the songbirds, is that they saw these patches, they saw the birds go extinct and said, oh my goodness, the songbird's going extinct, we need to fix it. And then a couple years later they said, hold on, these birds came back, they're still around, maybe we're wrong, and that's what caused them to start investigating what's happening. Now the reason the population, our species, persisted is because the timing of extinction of all of these patches is asynchronous. So let's say 2 of these patches can go extinct. That's okay, because we still have 3 other patches where our population's surviving and can send dispersers out to recolonize those extinct patches. If all of these patches went extinct all at once, what happens to our species? It's gone. It goes extinct. So a big part of this metapopulation is that everything is asynchronous. And that then leads us to the dynamics. So as I said, each patch has its own dynamics. You're going to have your own carrying capacity, you're going to have your own intrinsic rate of growth. And that means we also have our own regulatory factors that are operating. And then, because of that, you're going to see changes in our populations of each of these patches, and they're going to be unique for each patch. You have some patches that look to be relatively stable, like this one's pretty stable, that one's pretty stable, and then you have these other patches that go extinct, and our species is gone, and then it pops back up and then goes extinct and so forth. All right? What's important is that none of these individual patches are going to reach equilibrium for a very long time. We're always going to have random events that happen that cause our populations to crash and perhaps go extinct, but that's okay because we're going to get rescued by these other patches. All right? So our patches are going to experience booms and busts. Colonization is going to recover them. Notably, though, the overall metapopulation is going to look very stable. So you can have booms and busts in all these individual patches, but the overall metapopulation dynamics, if we take all of the patches, all the individuals, and lump them together, they're going to look pretty darn stable, and their probability of extinction is going to be pretty darn close to 0. I would say it's 0, but you know, as with anything, nothing is actually, no probability is a true 0. Unless I ask, what's the probability of flipping a heads or a tails and I don't even have a coin in my hand, right? That's a true probability. But the probability of extinction, we always have some probability. But for our metapopulation, it's effectively 0. Questions on our metapopulation. So there are. The more we've looked, so after those first studies on the European songbirds, the more that we've looked, the more that ecologists have recognized that there are a lot of species out there that exist as a metapopulation. So is fragmentation bad? Yeah, it does a lot of bad things. Is fragmentation going to wipe out all the species that used to live there? It's probably unlikely. Some of them may suffer, but a lot of our species that we're looking at can survive as a metapopulation. questions? These figures are up on the handouts if you were curious. All right, so summary of this. All populations fluctuate. They're going to fluctuate varying degrees based on the underlying regulatory factors, based on the underlying environmental conditions. All right? Now, our density-dependent factors tend to limit the degree of fluctuation that we see, and that noise is really contributed by our density-independent factors. Now, just because we have density-dependent factors at work doesn't mean we're going to be a stable population. All right, it's kind of an important point. If we're a stable population, yes, we do have density-dependent factors working, and they're probably the dominant factors. But just because we have these factors doesn't mean that we will become a stable population. As far as our density-dependent factors go, we mentioned two self-regulation mechanisms, two factors that are internal to the population: territoriality and social, or stress, I should say, stress. So crowding, and territoriality. Those are the two better ones. These factors, density-dependent, density-independent factors, can work in isolation, but normally it's the collection of all of these factors that help to regulate our populations. All right? And the only way that we can see what regulates our populations is to follow these long-term studies. And we'll see from these long-term studies that maybe we have a dominant factor at any one point in time, but that dominant factor can change through time. We did the wolf and the moose example on Isle Royale as an example of where our dominant factors change through time. Then we wrap this up to point out that some species exist as a metapopulation, where we have individual populations, these habitat patches, that will experience booms and busts. They'll have their own regulatory factors. They have their own dynamics, and some of those will go extinct, but those patches then get rescued by individuals from other patches. And the net result is that we have a pretty stable population of our species, I should say. Pretty stable metapopulation of our species. A key thing for this is asynchronous extinction, all right, which is kind of likely. All right? You have a wildfire that goes through, big patch of land out in California. Yeah, it's devastating. It caused a lot of extinction, local extinction there. But as long as you have populations existing in other patches, that area can be recolonized. Now, if we have, let's say, an asteroid strike that wipes out all of the forests in California, that's another story. All right, that's another story. Questions? Yes? No? All right, so we are on our home stretch, believe it or not. So we have a quiz for this part. Goes live probably in about 6 minutes. You'll get an email for Blackboard. I think I set it to release at 8:30. So I think I said you have until Friday. Make sure you watch, those of you that, I guess you're all watching it, review your notes, take the quiz, tell your friends. Due date's posted, so it's on their Blackboard calendar. All right. And with that, we will move on. So we talked about population growth, and we talked about the intrinsic rate of growth, right? Birth and death rates. Birth and death rates kind of lead us into our life history strategies. What's the strategy of life for an organism? And we can think about it ourselves. I mean, if I ask you, what's your strategy for living life? What would you say? Just think about that for a minute. What's your strategy for living life? What's that? One day at a time. Okay, one day at a time. In ecological terms, survival. All right, what's another strategy? What's another strategy? Reproduce. Wait until classes are done yet, all right? Okay, but no, we're just brainstorming, so reproduction. So we went from survival, that was a strategy. Then we have another strategy that says reproduction. Here's one, taking care of our offspring. Okay, survival's put on hold, reproduction's put on hold. We're taking care of our offspring. Those decisions represent strategies. For us, in some cases, we're making a conscious decision to do some of this stuff. In other cases, we're not really making that conscious decision. There's something about our biology that's saying, hey, we need to do something. We need to start moving forward with our life. And the organisms that we talk about, they're not making conscious decisions. They've got something that's programmed to say, hey, you're doing things at a certain time. All of these constitute a life history strategy. So Hope said, make enough money to eat and pay bills. And we'll say that is survival. Survival, maybe maintenance too. Maybe that could be maintenance. So life history strategy is a suite of life history traits adapted in a particular ecological context. It's a suite of life history traits adapted in a particular ecological context. The life history traits that we're talking about are anything that's related to our life processes, how we go through life, what we do, what our body does. All right? Life history traits that we can talk about would be reproductive effort, reproductive output, parental care, how many times we reproduce, how fast we grow, when we mature. All of those things are different life history traits. And our pattern, how we choose to use it, represents our strategy. Now, for our organisms, and even for humans, the overall strategy is shaped by natural selection. All right? It's shaped by natural selection. Natural selection specifies certain strategies are better than others. All right? If, say, Sebastian says, all I'm going to do is survival, what's your fitness? None, because we're not reproducing. All right? But if we take the other strategy of all reproducing, what's your fitness? Yeah, okay, so it's probably not going to be as good because you're worried about reproducing, but you're not taking care of yourself. So our mortality rates, so survival suffers. All right? That's the part of natural selection that's at work. It's trying to figure out what's our balance. And how does this balance come into play? Well, it depends on our environment. All right? Why does it depend on our environment? Because we're talking about fitness. And what are the three properties of fitness? Property of three properties of fitness. You've had it on a quiz, you've had it on an exam, you'll have it on a final exam, guaranteed. Three properties of fitness. Property of, what's up here? Property of the environment. Environment changes, our fitness changes. It's our property of our genotypes, right? Our phenotype, genotypes and phenotypes, they're related. So phenotype, genotype changes, our fitness changes, and we have to measure it over more than one generation, all right? You got to know those. They're all coming back, all right? So the life history strategies that we're going to talk about, we've broken them down into three different things. I know we're not going to finish life cycle today. We're going to finish life cycle tomorrow. We'll start lifespan, and we'll finish lifespan on Monday, and then I think that lifespan marks the end of our exam 3 material. All right, and that's kind of why I'm starting this today, so that we can finish it during our lecture on Monday. But the three components of the life history strategy include the life cycle, lifespan, and reproductive patterns. The life cycle is our pattern of growth and development. How do we grow? Are we going to have metamorphosis in our life cycle, or are we going to develop directly? Are we going to have a resting stage in our life cycle, or are we not going to have one? All right? That pattern, the last part was sex. Should we have a constant sex throughout our life, or should our species have the ability to change sex depending on the conditions or depending on the situation? That's all part of our life cycle. The second part of our strategy is lifespan. How long should we live? That is under natural selection. That's under selection. All right? The longer you live, the more opportunities you have to reproduce. And then lastly, we have the reproductive patterns. And my guess is that we'll spend more time on this reproductive patterns because there's a lot of aspects to it. So all of the reproductive patterns is like, how many times should we reproduce? How many offspring should we have? What should be our investment in those offspring? So should we have big offspring or small offspring? And all the associated trade-offs with all of that stuff. All right? And I think with the reproductive patterns, we'll then kind of relate all of this back to our survivorship curves and overall success of populations. All right? So we're going to, with these life history strategies, what we see usually represents an optimum strategy that was shaped by natural selection. Now, this strategy was determined by a series of evolutionary decisions, and those decisions were based on the allocation of energy. That's kind of where I started with, what's your strategy in life? Survival, reproduction. All of those represented an evolutionary decision on how we invest our energy. All right? Why is that important? It's because our organisms only have a finite amount of energy that's available to them. And generally speaking, they allocate it to three main terms. And here's the best star call-out bubble. We've got a finite amount of energy, and our organism is going to allocate it to one of three main processes: growth, reproduction, and maintenance. Those are the three main areas where they allocate this energy. Once you allocate the energy, your finite amount of energy, to one area, it's unavailable for the other areas. So if you invest all of your energy into growth, you have zero energy for reproduction and maintenance. And you might say, well, what is this maintenance stuff? It's things like cell respiration. It's things like the immune system. It's things like repairing your body. All right? It's just your basic metabolic rate and your immune system. All right? If you split it between growth and maintenance, you don't have any left over for reproduction. Now, if you equally divided it, that's fine. All three of these are getting it. But as soon as we start shifting some energy towards one or another type of process, that means that energy is unavailable for something else. That is what selection is favoring. It's figuring out how best do we allocate this energy. If you do it better than your neighbor, then you're going to have a higher fitness, and selection is going to favor you. Now, within each of these, we have our own individual trade-offs, and this is part of all of the allocation. So, for the growth, should we go for growth rates, or should we invest in size? Maybe we should have different size body parts. All right? But again, it's a series of trade-offs. For reproduction, which we'll spend quite a bit of time on, if we allocate energy towards producing a whole lot of offspring, that means we are not going to have a whole lot of energy available to increase their size. That's a series of trade-offs. For the maintenance, once you invest in the immune system, all right, are you going to invest in more of the innate type of response or the memory type of response? They both have two specific roles in the body. All right, so know that our life history strategies represent a decision on how best to allocate the energy. It's not a conscious decision. The organism didn't just wake up and say, hey, I think I'm going to reproduce today. It was kind of built into their genetic code, to their behaviors, to their desires. And if they did better, if they did it reproduced at the correct time, and that meant they had a higher fitness, then selection's going to favor that strategy. Now, how do we figure out what the best strategy is? So how do we measure fitness? Well, we recognize that our life history strategies, the strategies themselves, include more than one adaptation. So we started our talk this year talking about a single adaptation. All right? You got long arms, or you can have short arms. All right, so arm length, that was our one adaptations. Life history strategies aren't like that. We have to look at the suite of traits to figure out what the best strategy is. All right, because that's our overall fitness. Now, trade-offs exist between these individual components, and we'll see some of those. All right, but note that a single component isn't going to be the sole determinant of fitness. We have to look at the suite of traits that are in our strategy. Also note that we have different strategies for different situations. So it's not just this species is good, this is their life history strategy, and that's fixed. That's not the case. We have to look at the individual populations, at the individual conditions that they're faced to figure out what the best strategy is. The examples that we have are related to things like age at maturity or size at maturity of small fish in rivers. And we've got several examples where in those areas where there's no predators, they grow more slowly. They start reproducing in a larger size. Why? Because they don't have that predation risk. But as soon as that predator gets there, it places a selective force to favor those individuals who grow quickly and reproduce early. Now, it comes at a cost. If you're going to do that, you've invested more energy into your growth, which means you're going to have less energy available for reproduction. You might not be producing as many offspring or as higher quality offspring. But that's okay because you're able to get to reproductive age faster than some other populations. So our strategy depends on our environment, and what we see in a population could differ. That's all part of our contingency. Now the question is, how do we compare our strategies? What's our measure of fitness? Well, in the grad class that I teach, we often try to find a proxy for fitness. We try to find some measure that is correlated to fitness. So it might not represent the actual fitness of the organism, but at least it allows us to see how a change in a single feature will alter our overall fitness. When we talk about a strategy, our fitness, the proxy for fitness that we use is something called reproductive value. All right, reproductive value has a variable v sub x. So we've got that x term in there again, which means that our reproductive value is going to change based on the age of the organism. So what is reproductive value? Reproductive value is the expected reproductive contribution to the next generation of an individual of age x. Get that written down. It's the expected reproductive contribution to the next generation of an individual of age x. So what's our expected reproductive contribution to our next generation? And that's going to vary based on our age. How do we calculate it? Well, I provide the equation here. All right, the sum from starting at x to infinity of L sub t times B sub t over L sub x. This isn't a mistake. I've got my t's here, and I have my x. So our t starts at x and then goes until the end of the life. But this L sub x stays the same. So what is L sub t, L sub x? What are those terms? What do you think those terms are? What do you think it is? What is it? What is L sub x in our life table? It's what? L sub x? Survivorship? Survivorship? So this is L sub x is survivorship. What's B? So if we start at the beginning, this is LXBX. So what is B sub x in our life tables? It's what? Yeah, it's our birth schedule. All right? So a reproductive value is gauging current and future births. Current and future births relative to just surviving today. That's kind of a verbalization of what this equation is doing. It's trying to ask that question. Should we reproduce now because we're unlikely to live to tomorrow? Or should we invest our energy into surviving today because we have higher reproductive output tomorrow? That's what our reproductive effort or reproductive value is doing. It's gauging that assessment, that risk assessment. Should we just survive today because our reproductive potential is better tomorrow? Or is survival so bad that we should just go ahead and reproduce? All right? So we're looking at current and future births relative, so current and future births relative to just surviving today. And what this number will give us is the expected number of offspring that we'll produce today and for the rest of our life. Because we do have to account for today as reproduction. Note, since we start at the age that we're interested in, we exclude all previous reproductive output. Because our reproductive value is all about us today and in the future. It can care less what happened in the past. So we're left with the choices. Should I put my energy, my available finite energy, into reproducing now, or should I invest it in survival? Because the chances and the prospects of reproducing are much better tomorrow. That's the choice. That's what reproductive value is trying to tell us. And it gives us an idea of what type of strategies we should choose. Questions? All right, what we'll do is we'll stop here and we'll review reproductive value, because then what we'll do is talk about how we use this to predict which strategies are better, or which strategy is the better strategy. I give the equation just so you can understand this part of it, the explanations. I'm not going to ask you to calculate it. And we could in our life tables, but we won't do it. We won't calculate it. All right? All right, so if you have any questions as you review this material, please email me. And I did see the Blackboard announcement went out, or the Blackboard notification went out. The quiz is live. All right. Don't forget lab. The allelopathy stuff has to be, those leachates needed to be set up. If you don't get it, you'll have a 0 for next week's lab. Have a good one.